Immediately following the attack, U.S. representatives in Saigon met with representatives of the South Vietnamese government. They jointly agreed that joint retaliatory action was required. The President's approval of this action was given after the action was discussed with and recommended by the National Security Council at a meeting held between 7:45 p.m. and 9 p.m. last night.
Morning, February 7th, 1965. Camp Holloway, Pleiku, South Vietnam. Smoke still rises from a row of burned-out Huey helicopters, their frames blackened, rotors twisted into the mud. A general walks the flight line, boots crunching over spent shell casings and shattered glass. Behind him, medics carry a stretcher toward a waiting aircraft. 8 men will not be going home. Nearby, a wounded soldier sits against a sandbag wall, arm in a sling, staring at what used to be the flight line. He doesn't look up when the general passes. In Washington, camera flashbulbs pop across a map spread on a conference table. Robert McNamara stands over it, pointing at a coastline 4,000 miles from where he's standing, laying out a response that has already been approved. Reporters lean in. Nobody in that room is asking whether this was the right call anymore. That question was already settled hours ago. On a carrier deck in the South China Sea, engines scream to life. 49 aircraft, one after another, catapult into gray sky, wings loaded, turning north toward North Vietnam. This has already happened. The base has already burned. The order has already been given. What you're watching right now is the end of a decision that took 12 hours to make, and the beginning of a war that would take 3 years to stop. To understand how a mortar attack on a helicopter base turned into 49 jets over North Vietnam by the next afternoon, we have to go back, not months, not weeks, 12 hours, to the exact minute this started. By February of 1965, McGeorge Bundy was not a soldier. He had never worn a uniform in combat, never held a rifle in anger. He was 45 years old, a former Harvard dean, and for 4 years he had been the man who decided which pieces of the world's chaos reached the president's desk first. As Special Assistant for National Security Affairs, Bundy briefed Lyndon Johnson every morning on a war that, on paper, still belonged to the South Vietnamese Army. In practice, it belonged more and more to Washington with every passing week. Robert McNamara worked 2 floors above the Oval Office in the same administration. The Secretary of Defense, who had come from Ford Motor Company, believing more than almost anyone else in Washington that a war could be measured, modeled, and controlled like a production line. McNamara's world was troop levels, sortie counts, kill ratios, the language of a conflict he was trying to manage as an engineering problem rather than a human one. In early 1965, his numbers were telling him something Bundy's instincts already suspected. The current strategy of advice and support was not enough. Something had to change, and soon. On February 4th, 1965, Bundy landed in Saigon on what was billed publicly as a routine fact-finding trip. Privately, it was closer to a verdict-gathering mission. The South Vietnamese government had just survived another coup attempt, its 4th collapse of civilian leadership in 15 months. Bundy's assignment was to look Ambassador Maxwell Taylor and General William Westmoreland in the eye, and answer one question for President Johnson. Was South Vietnam still worth saving? And if so, what would it cost to save it? What do you think a man like Bundy, an academic, not a soldier, was really looking for on that trip? 3 days into his visit, Bundy had not yet found his answer. He had read briefings, studied maps, absorbed casualty figures typed neatly on cable paper. What he had not yet seen was the war itself. The smell of it, the weight of it, the version that didn't fit on a single page. That would change before he left the country. 200 miles northeast of Saigon, in the Central Highlands, sat Pleiku, a market town of wooden shop fronts and red dirt roads. Its strategic value tied to one fact. It sat astride the corridors North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces used to move men and supplies south, feeding the eastern spurs of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 3 miles outside town, Camp Holloway housed American helicopter crews, Army Special Forces advisors, and the aircraft that kept South Vietnamese infantry mobile across terrain no road could reliably reach. It was not a frontline fortress, it was a support base, built for logistics, not for defending against a coordinated ground assault. The Viet Cong's 409th Battalion had been watching Camp Holloway for weeks. Reconnaissance teams mapped the wire, timed the guard rotations, counted the aircraft parked in the open. This was not an improvised raid dreamed up overnight. It was a rehearsed operation built around a single exploitable fact. The base was lightly defended, and its helicopters sat wingtip to wingtip with no revetments to absorb a blast. On the American side, the calculus was different, and in hindsight, dangerously thin. Camp Holloway had never been hit directly. The advisory mission in the Highlands was considered a background assignment, unglamorous, low risk, the kind of posting that rarely made the newspapers back home. Soldiers rotated through on relatively short tours, more focused on keeping the helicopters flying than on preparing for a battalion-sized night assault against their own perimeter. 2 men, an ocean apart in mindset, if not in geography, carried the weight of decisions neither fully controlled. Bundy, in Saigon, was there to write a report Johnson would read once and likely forget within a week, unless something forced him to remember it. McNamara, still largely working the problem from Washington, was pushing for a policy of sustained reprisal, a doctrine that argued America should respond to Viet Cong attacks not case by case, but as a continuous campaign, whether or not any single attack justified it in isolation. He had not yet found the attack that would let him prove it. McNamara's doctrine mattered because of what it implied, that the next attack, whenever and wherever it came, would not be treated as an isolated incident to be absorbed and forgotten, the way dozens of smaller strikes had been in 1964. It would be treated as a threshold. Somewhere in Washington, that threshold was already being defined in memos few outside the National Security Council would ever read. Neither side yet knew how their separate calculations were about to collide. Bundy was in country to assess a war that existed for him mostly on paper. The 409th Battalion was about to write a very different kind of answer, in fire, on the exact ground his itinerary would carry him to within 72 hours. What Bundy was about to see at Pleiku wouldn't just change one report, It would change the shape of the war itself. On the evening of February 6, 1965, the 409th Viet Cong Battalion began moving into position. Roughly 300 men split into assault teams, sapper squads, and a mortar section, advancing through rubber plantations and drainage ditches, ringing Camp Holloway's perimeter. They had rehearsed the approach in daylight, on terrain sketched from weeks of reconnaissance. By full dark, they were in place along a tree line less than 100 meters from the outer wire, waiting for a signal. Inside the base, the night shift moved through routines that had not changed in months. Guards walked fixed patrol routes. A handful of Huey helicopters sat parked in open rows, rotors folded, wingtip to wingtip along the flight line. A configuration that made sense for a base that had never been directly hit, and a liability for a base that was about to be. If this base had absorbed smaller attacks before and shrugged them off, what made this night different? No one on duty that evening could have answered that. That was the entire logic of the plan, taking shape in the dark beyond the wire, hit hard enough once that it couldn't be shrugged off. At 12:22 a.m., the first 81mm mortar rounds arced over the perimeter. Within seconds, sapper teams cut through the wire at multiple points, moving fast toward the flight line and the barracks where American advisors slept. Small arms fire opened almost simultaneously, a coordinated assault built to overwhelm response time before base defenders could organize. The barracks housing American advisors took direct hits within the first minute. Wooden structures, never built to withstand explosive charges, came apart around the men sleeping inside. Some woke to fire and smoke instead of alarms. Some never had time to reach for a weapon at all. On the flight line, the exposed helicopters became easy targets. Satchel charges and small arms fire tore through fuselages staged less than 10 feet apart. A single well-placed charge capable of damaging 2 or 3 aircraft at once, simply because of how tightly they'd been parked. Inside the wire, American and South Vietnamese personnel began organizing a defense in the chaos. But the sappers had already achieved what they came for: maximum damage in minimum time before any coordinated counterattack could form. This was not a battle fought for ground. It was a raid built entirely around inflicting a number large enough that Washington could not look away from it. That number was already being tallied before the attack had even ended. By 1 a.m., the worst of it had passed. The 409th Battalion, objective achieved, withdrew back into the darkness along the same routes it had used to approach. A hit-and-run raid, not a fight for territory. What remained was smoke, wreckage, and a casualty count that would keep climbing through the morning. 8 Americans dead, well over 100 wounded, 10 aircraft destroyed outright, another 15 damaged beyond immediate use. In the confusion, South Vietnamese Ranger and Regional Force units stationed nearby moved to reinforce the perimeter. But by the time they arrived in strength, the 409th Battalion was already gone, melted back into the surrounding countryside and the villages that offered no resistance and asked no questions. Search patrols swept the tree lines through the following hours and found little. A handful of blood trails, a few discarded items, no bodies to confirm how many of the attackers, if any, had been killed. The battalion had planned its exit as carefully as its entry. A raid built to leave no trace behind had just left one impossible to ignore. 8 American dead, broadcast within hours to a president who had been trying to avoid exactly this moment. For the first time since American advisors had arrived in Vietnam in meaningful numbers, an attack had directly and unmistakably targeted U.S. personnel and killed them in a concentration too large to file away as an isolated incident. The hardest questions about this war were rarely asked out loud while it was happening. What a single night like this one should cost, and who gets to decide? This channel exists to ask them anyway, with the same respect the men who lived through it deserve. If that matters to you, subscribe and stay with us for what happened in the 12 hours after this cable reached Washington. 7,000 miles away, it was still the afternoon of February 6th in the capital. The report of the attack would not reach the White House Situation Room until the early morning hours. But when it did, it would land on desks belonging to men who had spent months already arguing over exactly this scenario. The attack was over in 20 minutes. What it triggered in Washington would take 12 hours and change everything after it. The cable reached the White House Situation Room in the early hours of February 11th, Washington time. President Johnson was woken and briefed by phone. The National Security Council was summoned into emergency session before sunrise. Not the routine morning briefing, but an unscheduled meeting that pulled in Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and congressional leadership, including Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield and House Speaker John McCormack. In Saigon, McGeorge Bundy had already been woken with the same news hours earlier by local time. He did not wait for instructions from Washington. Alongside General Westmoreland and Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, Bundy boarded a flight to Pleiku that same morning, not to observe from a briefing document, but to stand on the ground while the damage was still being counted. What he found on arrival was not an abstraction. Burned-out helicopter husks still smoldered on the flight line. Wounded soldiers filled the base's small medical facility beyond capacity, waiting for evacuation. Body bags were being prepared under a gray Highland sky. For a man who had spent 4 years managing this war through cables, memos, and casualty tables, the difference between reading about 8 dead Americans and standing among the wreckage that killed them was not subtle. Something in Bundy's calculus shifted that morning, and it would show within hours. At Camp Holloway itself, the visit carried weight beyond the men who witnessed it. Bundy walked through the base hospital, speaking briefly with wounded soldiers on stretchers lining the corridor, men who, hours earlier, had been asleep in their bunks. He asked few questions. He did not need to. The scene answered most of what his briefing papers back in Saigon had left abstract. Casualty figures were not numbers on a page here. They were names, faces, and the particular quiet of men trying not to show how much pain they were in for the visiting official standing over them. Whatever report Bundy had planned to write before that morning, it was no longer the report he was going to send. By early afternoon, Bundy placed a call back to Washington. His recommendation was immediate and unambiguous: retaliate and retaliate now. He would later write to Johnson that the situation in Vietnam was deteriorating and that, without new American action, defeat looked probable within a year. Not weeks, but not many months either. There was still time to change course, Bundy wrote, but not much of it. The memo he began drafting that afternoon would later become one of the most consequential documents of the early war, not because of any single line, but because it marked the moment a presidential advisor stopped recommending patience and started recommending force. Was Bundy's recommendation the clear-eyed judgment of a man who had finally seen the war firsthand, or the emotional reaction of an academic standing too close to a smoking battlefield for the first time? Historians have never fully agreed, and neither at the time did everyone inside the administration. In Washington, McNamara did not need convincing. Pleiku was the exact scenario his doctrine of sustained reprisal had been built to answer. A single, undeniable attack large enough to justify a response that had been debated in the abstract for months. Within the emergency NSC session, McNamara pressed for immediate retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam, framing the decision not as a one-time reprisal, but as the opening move in a policy Washington had been circling for half a year. Dean Rusk raised caution, questioning whether direct retaliation against North Vietnam risked drawing the Soviet Union and China more directly into the conflict, a concern sharpened by the fact that Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin was, at that very moment, arriving in Hanoi on a state visit. Striking North Vietnam while a senior Soviet official stood on its soil was not a decision to make lightly. Johnson listened to both arguments. He had spent over a year trying to avoid exactly this juncture, the moment where advisory support could no longer be separated from direct American military action against the North. By midday, he had made his decision. Just 12 hours after the attack on Camp Holloway, Johnson ordered Operation Flaming Dart, retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese military targets, to launch before the day was out. The order took 12 hours to sign. It would take years to undo what it started. At 2:01 p.m. on February 7th, aboard the USS Coral Sea and USS Hancock, steaming in the South China Sea, flight decks that had been quiet all morning came alive at once. 49 aircraft, Navy fighter bombers loaded with bombs and rockets, joined by a contingent of South Vietnamese Air Force Sky Raiders, were spotted for launch against military barracks and staging areas near Giong Hoi, roughly 40 miles north of the demilitarized zone. Pilots who had trained for months without a single combat mission were being briefed on a target package that had existed as a contingency plan on paper for weeks and was now, without warning, real. Weather over the target was poor. Low cloud, reduced visibility, the kind of conditions that turn a precision strike into a rougher approximation of one. Commanders launched anyway. 12 hours after Camp Holloway, waiting any longer was no longer politically possible. Somewhere over the South China Sea, men who had never dropped a bomb in anger were about to fly the mission that would define the rest of the war. One after another, aircraft catapulted off the decks into gray sky, formed up and turned north, toward a coastline most of them had only studied on briefing charts, radar-guided anti-aircraft fire and the low ceiling made target identification difficult. Some pilots found their assigned barracks obscured by cloud entirely and had to circle burning fuel, searching for a gap. Others released ordnance on secondary targets when the primary was unreachable. It was not the clean, decisive strike the mission had been sold, as in Washington. It was young men in fast aircraft doing violent, imprecise work under pressure, in weather that punished every mistake. Back at Camp Holloway, the war looked entirely different. There were no jets, no formations, no maps with red arrows. There was a field hospital operating past its intended capacity, medics working through a second consecutive shift without rest, and 8 names being confirmed, one at a time, for telegrams that had not yet been sent to families in Ohio, in Texas, in California. Families who would learn in the coming days that their son or husband had died in a place most of them had never heard pronounced correctly. What would you have told those families if the job of writing that telegram had landed on your desk instead of a stranger's? For the wounded who survived the night, February 7th did not end with the sunrise. It continued in the slow, unglamorous work of triage, sorting the men who could be stabilized on site from those who needed evacuation to Nha Trang or further to hospitals with the equipment Camp Holloway's small aid station didn't have. Helicopters that had survived the attack, patched enough to fly, made repeated runs, engines straining, carrying men who, 12 hours earlier, had been asleep in bunks now reduced to splinters and ash. While pilots 400 miles north searched for targets through cloud cover, the cost of the attack that sent them there was still being counted, bed by bed, in a hospital tent that had never been built for this many patients at once. Aboard the Coral Sea, the mission's toll came into focus only after the last aircraft trapped back onto the deck. One Sky Raider had been lost to ground fire near the target area, its pilot recovered by a rescue helicopter that itself flew into the same weather that had blinded the strike package earlier that day. Deck crews who had spent the morning arming aircraft for a mission that didn't exist yet spent the evening counting the same aircraft back in, doing the quiet arithmetic every carrier crew learns early: how many launched, how many returned, and what that difference means for the men waiting below deck for news. For the pilots who did make it back, debriefs ran long into the night, not the triumphant kind, but the exhausted, technical kind. Officers comparing notes on cloud ceilings and missed run-ins, trying to reconstruct what damage had actually been done through weather that had refused to cooperate with anyone's plan. Some described the mission bluntly, off the record, as harder and messier than anything the briefing slides had prepared them for. By evening, flaming d'artois results filtered back through after-action reports that read, even by the standards of military language, as guarded. Damage assessment was limited by the same weather that had complicated the strikes themselves. Some targets were confirmed hit, others remained uncertain. Smoke and cloud cover making battle damage assessment from the air unreliable. It was, by any honest measure, a mission that had done less than its planners hoped and more than its skeptics had wanted. In Saigon, Bundy received word of the strike results the same evening. There was no triumphant cable back to Washington, no declaration of a clean victory. What existed instead was a quieter, harder truth settling in among the men who had ordered the mission. Retaliation had been delivered on schedule exactly as promised, and neither the war in the Central Highlands nor the debate in Washington was over. If anything, both had just begun in earnest. At Camp Holloway, as the sun set on a base still smelling of smoke and aviation fuel, nobody was celebrating 49 sorties flown against Jong Hoi. They were counting cots, writing names, and waiting for the plane still overdue to make it back to the carriers. The turn in this story is not a battlefield reversal. There was no counterattack that broke the Viet Cong, no last-minute reinforcement that saved the day. The turning point at Pleiku was procedural, and in some ways that makes it more consequential, not less. It was the moment American war-making shifted from a system of case-by-case responses into something closer to a standing policy. 2 days after Flaming Dart won, on February 10th, Viet Cong forces struck again, this time at Quy Nhon, roughly 100 miles south along the coast, bombing a barracks housing American enlisted men. 23 Americans were killed, more than double the toll at Camp Holloway. If Pleiku had been treated as an isolated incident requiring a one-time response, Quy Nhon eliminated that interpretation entirely. Within 48 hours, Johnson ordered Flaming Dart II, a second wave of strikes against North Vietnamese targets. Do you think 2 attacks in 4 days actually changed Washington's strategic calculation, or simply gave officials who already wanted escalation the justification they'd been waiting for? That question sat, unresolved, inside the National Security Council itself. McNamara's doctrine of sustained reprisal had effectively been validated by events, whether or not the events had been shaped to fit the doctrine, or the doctrine had simply been sitting ready for the first attack large enough to trigger it. The distinction mattered enormously to the historians who would spend the next half-century arguing over it. And it mattered just as much in real time to the men in uniform who would fly the missions that followed. Within a month, on March 2nd, 1965, the retaliatory strikes evolved into something categorically different. Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that would continue, with brief pauses, for more than 3 years, dropping over 1 million tons of ordnance before it ended. What began as a response to a single mortar and sapper raid on a helicopter base in the Central Highlands had become the framework for the longest sustained American bombing campaign since the Second World War. Camp Holloway was the spark. Rolling Thunder was the fire nobody could put out again. In Hanoi, the response to Flaming Dart was not capitulation, but resolve. North Vietnamese leadership, backed by increasing material support from Moscow and Beijing, treated the American strikes as confirmation that Washington intended a longer war rather than a symbolic one, and adjusted their own posture accordingly, accelerating the movement of regular North Vietnamese Army units south to reinforce Viet Cong formations that had, until that point, fought largely on their own. The retaliation meant to deter further attacks, instead signaled to Hanoi that the stakes and the American commitment had both just risen. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, still in Hanoi when the first strikes landed, used the moment to press for expanded Soviet military aid, surface-to-air missiles, radar systems, advisors, aid that would, within a year, make the skies over North Vietnam dramatically more dangerous for the pilots flying missions like the ones launched from the Coral Sea and Hancock that first week. For Bundy, the shift was personal as much as strategic. The memo he wrote from Saigon, warning that South Vietnam's collapse looked probable within a year without new American action, became one of the defining documents cited in the decision to escalate. Bundy would later be associated, for the rest of his career, with the pivot from advisory support to direct American military engagement in Vietnam, a legacy neither wholly praised nor wholly condemned, but rarely discussed without reference to the 12 hours he spent walking through Camp Holloway's wreckage. For McNamara, Pleiku offered something close to vindication, a demonstrated case where sustained reprisal had moved from theory to policy with, in the administration's internal view, minimal domestic backlash and clear congressional support in the immediate aftermath. That confidence would prove costly in ways not yet visible in February 1965. The metrics McNamara trusted to measure the war's progress, body counts, sortie totals, tonnage dropped, would, over the following 3 years, tell a story that increasingly diverged from the reality on the ground. None of that was visible yet. In the immediate aftermath of Pleiku, what was visible was momentum, a war that had been managed at arm's length, now moving toward direct, sustained American military engagement, with the men who made that decision believing, for the moment, that they had found the doctrine that would finally turn the tide. By the end of February 1965, the immediate human cost of Camp Holloway was final in a way the strategic cost was not. 8 Americans killed in the initial attack, and 23 more at Quy Nhon 4 days later. 31 men whose names went out in telegrams within the same 2-week span. Families across the country receiving the same visit from an officer in dress uniform, same folded flag, the same silence that follows it. More than 200 additional wounded between the 2 attacks would carry injuries, visible and otherwise, for the rest of their lives. At Camp Holloway itself, the physical wreckage was repaired within weeks. New revetments built for the helicopters this time, spaced and hardened in ways the original layout had never required. The base resumed operations. The war in the Central Highlands continued much as it had before, and within a year, the scale of what followed Pleiku would make the original attack look, in relative terms, almost minor. That is, in its own way, part of the cost, an event significant enough to reshape American war policy, absorbed within months into a war that had grown far larger than the incident that helped launch it. For McGeorge Bundy, the cost was different, carried not in casualties but in consequence. The memo he wrote from Saigon in February 1965 would follow him for the rest of his public life, cited in nearly every historical account of the escalation as one of the documents that tipped Washington from limited support toward direct, sustained military engagement. Bundy never fully disowned the recommendation, but in later years, as the war ground on far longer and cost far more than anyone at the NSC session anticipated in February 1965, his public reflections on Vietnam grew notably more guarded, more careful, less certain than the man who had called for immediate retaliation from a hospital corridor in Pleiku. For Robert McNamara, the cost arrived even more slowly and cut even deeper. The doctrine of sustained reprisal that Pleiku seemed to validate would, over the following 3 years, expand into Rolling Thunder's million-ton bombing campaign. A campaign McNamara himself would later conclude, in memoirs written decades afterward, had failed to achieve its central strategic objectives while contributing to a death toll on both sides that dwarfed anything discussed in the NSC session on February 7, 1965. McNamara's own reckoning with that failure became in time one of the more discussed institutional apologies in modern American military history, though it came far too late for the men whose telegrams had already been delivered. What Pleiku cost in the end was not measured only in the 8 names on the initial casualty list or the 31 across both February attacks. It was measured in a war that, before Pleiku, had still been arguably reversible, still small enough that a change in policy could have meaningfully altered its course, and that, after Pleiku, had crossed into a scale and a momentum that no single decision by any one man in Washington or Saigon could fully undo again. Would the decisions made in that NSC session have looked different if the men making them had spent as much time as Bundy did at Camp Holloway that morning, standing among the wounded rather than reading about them? For the families of the 31 men killed at Camp Holloway and Quy Nhon, the strategic debate in Washington was never the point. What mattered was a knock on a door in Ohio, in Texas, in California, a name, a rank, a date, and the particular kind of silence that follows a folded flag. Some of those families would spend years trying to understand why their son's death had become, in the history books that eventually got written, a footnote to a policy decision rather than the center of the story itself. That imbalance between the weight an event carries in a family's life and the weight it carries in a strategic memo is its own kind of cost, one that rarely gets counted alongside body totals and sortie numbers. The base was rebuilt. The men were not. It is a cost that outlives every policy that caused it, carried quietly by people who were never in the room where the decision was made. 60 years of hindsight have not settled the argument that began at Camp Holloway. Historians still divide over whether Pleiku was the moment Washington made an unavoidable decision in response to an attack that demanded a response, or the moment officials who had already decided on escalation found the justification they had been waiting months to use. Both readings are supported by the same documents. Neither has ever fully defeated the other. What is not in dispute is the sequence. 8 Americans died at Camp Holloway. 12 hours later, 49 aircraft struck North Vietnam. 4 days after that, 23 more Americans died at Quy Nhon. And within a month, Operation Rolling Thunder had begun, a campaign that would run for more than 3 years and drop over 1 million tons of bombs before it ended, having failed, by McNamara's own later admission, to break North Vietnam's will to continue the war. McGeorge Bundy stood at Camp Holloway for a matter of hours. Robert McNamara never set foot there at all during the crisis, managing the response entirely from Washington. Between them, working from very different vantage points, one from the wreckage itself, one from a map on a conference table 7,000 miles away. They helped move a limited advisory war onto a course that neither fully controlled once it began. The question this story leaves unanswered is not whether the retaliation was militarily justified. Reasonable people then and now land on different sides of that question and defend their position with the same set of facts. The harder question is whether an attack on a helicopter base in the Central Highlands should have been enough on its own to set in motion a policy that would ultimately outlast the men who authorized it, the doctrine that justified it, and, in some cases, the certainty either Bundy or McNamara carried into that NSC session on the morning of February 7th, 1965. In the years that followed, both men addressed Vietnam in very different registers. McNamara's later reckoning, decades of quiet, then a public and much discussed reassessment of the war's costs and miscalculations, became one of the more remarkable acts of institutional self-examination in modern American public life, arriving too late to change anything, but early enough to shape how history would eventually judge the decisions made in that February NSC session. Bundy, by contrast, remained more guarded in public for the rest of his life, rarely revisiting Pleiku directly, though colleagues who knew him in later years described a man who understood more clearly than most how much weight that single morning at Camp Holloway had carried. What both men left behind was not a clean verdict, but a case study, one still taught, still argued over, still cited whenever the question of how nations decide to escalate a war comes up again. The mortar rounds that landed at Camp Holloway in the dark hours of February 7th, 1965, lasted only minutes. The policy they helped set in motion lasted years, and its consequences for the men who fought under it and the country that sent them are still being measured. That question was never resolved in 1965. It has not been resolved since. There are no clean answers in a story like this one. There rarely are. The men who died at Camp Holloway never got a vote in what happened afterward. Neither did the pilots who flew into weather they couldn't see through, chasing targets a room in Washington had decided mattered more than the fog said they should. 12 hours, that's all it took to turn one bad night into 3 years of bombs. Nobody in that room was a villain. Nobody was entirely right either. That's what this war never let anyone forget. If this story left you with more questions than answers about what we ask of the people we send, there are resources in the description for the ones still carrying those questions in their bodies, not just their minds.